If you clicked on this video, you probably are wondering how to write a conflicts of interest statement or competing interest statement for your manuscript. You might be wondering what is considered a conflict of interest and what do you actually need to disclose. And you might be wondering whether there is specific language that you need to use in a conflict of interest statement. So in this video, I'll share what are conflicts of interest and why they need to be disclosed, what are the different types of conflicts of interest, and examples of conflicts of interest statements that you can use for your manuscript. And if we haven't met, hello, my name is Crystal Heron. I'm a trained biomedical scientist turned clinical researcher and now scientific and medical editor, and I've helped thousands of scientists, clinicians, and other professional writers write with intention so they can master the craft of writing and maximize their impact in their field. So most journals require that authors disclose any conflicts of interest related to the work in a manuscript. They require authors to complete and sign specific forms, and they ask for specific language in a dedicated section of the manuscript. And I also recommend disclosing any conflicts of interest in the cover letter with your submission, and some journals require that as well. And in case you'd like a cover letter template, I'll add a link to one that I created in the description box for you. So what is a conflict of interest? A conflict of interest is a situation in which an interest or connection could, at least in theory, interfere with your objectivity in conducting or reporting the research. And these interests or connections can be direct or indirect, and they generally fall into one of two categories, financial and non-financial. The most common financial conflict of interest in academia is grants to the author or organization. And this includes federal grants, such as from the NIH or NSF or DoD, and it also includes foundation grants. And some funders also require that you include specific statements or information in the manuscript. For example, NIH requires that you include an acknowledgement of grant support with the name of the institute, grant number, the level of funding, and a disclaimer that the content is solely the responsibility of the author and does not necessarily represent the official views of the National Institutes of Health. And other funding agencies may have their own requirements, so be sure to check their website and your funding agreement to ensure that you include the correct information. Also, many journals have a separate section for funding details, but if not, include them in the conflicts of interest section, or sometimes they might go in the acknowledgement section. Another type of financial conflict of interest that needs to be disclosed are funds received from a private donor. Whether you include the donor's name in the conflicts of interest statement will depend on the agreement that you or the organization have with the donor, so be sure to check what you need to disclose based on that agreement. Another type of financial conflict of interest that you need to disclose is any related employment or voluntary involvement. For example, if you are an employee of the company that conducted the research, you need to disclose that information in the conflicts of interest statement. You also need to disclose any collaborations with advocacy groups related to the content of the manuscript. For example, if you are on the board of a patient advocacy group focused on the disease that you study, or if you are on an advisory board of a startup company doing research in the disease area, you need to disclose these relationships. You also need to disclose any financial benefit related to personal fees. So these fees include things like honoraria or consulting fees or lecture fees, presentation fees, or even providing an expert testimony. They can also include support for attending meetings or conferences. But these fees are not always relevant to disclose as conflicts of interest, which we'll get into in a moment. Another type of financial conflict of interest to disclose is intellectual property. So this includes things like copyrights or royalties or patents, such as for the drug formula or device that were used in the study. You also need to disclose any stock or share ownership in a company. For example, I have a client who started a drug development company, and the work in the manuscript was done at the company, so they had to disclose their stock ownership in the conflict of interest statement of that manuscript. Now, this list is not exhaustive because there are other types of financial relationships that you might have, so be sure to disclose any other financial benefits related to the development of the work. The other type of conflicts of interest is non-financial. In academia and sometimes industry, a common non-financial conflict of interest is gifts. And this often looks like providing study materials such as drugs or reagents or equipment, tools, software, any material that someone gave you to do the work. For example, when I was in graduate school, a vector that I used was a gift from a collaborator, and so that detail was disclosed in the manuscript. Another common non-financial conflict of interest is access to data repositories. For example, if a collaborator or organization gave you access to a database with data from a prior or ongoing study, you would need to disclose that detail. Another type of non-financial conflict of interest is holding a position on boards. Now, I already mentioned this detail under the financial conflicts of interest, but sometimes these positions are not paid, so it would be considered non-financial. You also need to disclose any close relationships with editors at the journal. For example, if the editor is a collaborator or works at your institution, or if you are an editor at that journal, then you need to disclose that information. You also need to disclose any other competing interests, such as personal, political, religious, or academic interests related to the work that might be a conflict of interest. For example, if you are a religious leader publishing about research related to your religion, then you need to disclose that detail. You also need to disclose any involvement in legal action related to the work. For example, if you had a paper retracted for some reason or some other legal action took place or is taking place, then you need to disclose that detail. Now, this list is also not exhaustive because there are other types of non-financial relationships that you might have, so be sure to disclose any other non-financial benefits related to the development of the work. Now, not all of the examples I listed need to be disclosed. When choosing what conflicts of interest to disclose in a manuscript, you want to consider whether the potential conflict of interest is connected to the work in that particular manuscript. You do not need to disclose an unrelated interest or connection. For example, if your manuscript describes a study of zebrafish, then you do not need to disclose that you are on the board of your local food pantry. Or if you are on the board of a different journal than the one you're submitting to, then you do not need to disclose that detail. However, if your study tested a drug from a certain company and you own stock in that company, then you would need to disclose that connection. Now, some journals have specific requirements about what interests must be disclosed and the date range that you need to include. For example, some journals request that you disclose any conflicts of interest over the past 3 years or other number of years. So be sure to check the journal requirements carefully so that you include the correct and relevant information. Also, I need to note that some authors have shared with me that they are afraid to disclose any conflicts of interest because they do not want to appear biased in any way. But ethically, you need to disclose any conflicts of interest fully and honestly. And I believe that it's better to over-disclose than under-disclose. Better safe than sorry. So what are some examples of conflicts of interest statements? How exactly do they need to be worded? First, be sure to check the journal requirements because some journals have specific guidelines and even specific language that they want you to use. And this is often the case when authors have no conflicts of interest to disclose. But if the journal does not request specific language, in these cases, you can use something like, "We have no conflicts of interest to disclose," or "All authors declare that they have no conflicts of interest." Now, what if any of the authors have at least one conflict of interest? In this case, you need to list them out for each author. In general, you want to list conflicts of interest for each author separately by name or initials, depending on the journal's preference. And there isn't a recommended order, so you might list them in the same order as the author order in the byline, or alphabetically, or in order of greatest to least amount of conflicts of interest. For example, you might have John Smith declares no conflicts of interest. Jane Williams has received a research grant from Organization A, grant number 12345. Mike Miller is an employee and owns stock in Company B. Or if you need to use initials, you might have something like ABC was executive director of Organization A and received a part-time salary for this work. DEF is on the board of Journal X. GHI has a patent pending for compound Y. The remaining authors have no conflicts of interest to declare. These are just a couple of examples. The exact language will vary by your author group and the conflicts of interest that they need to disclose. And of course, be sure to check the author guidelines for any specific requirements or language that you might need to use. So now you know what conflicts of interest are, why you need to disclose them, and what are the different types. And you've seen some examples of conflicts of interest statements that you can use for your manuscript. And if you found this information helpful, you might also like this video about who actually qualifies for authorship in a manuscript. This video is part of a series on authorship that includes who qualifies for authorship on a manuscript, how to order authors on the byline, and how to strategically plan authorship as the research project develops. And if there's something in particular that you'd like to learn more about, let me know in the comments. I create these videos for you, so I want to make sure that I'm creating something that you will find valuable. Thank you so much for watching. Have a lovely day, and I hope to see you in the next video.